one thing you will not learn in a hookup is the skills you need to, create good sex or the emotional connection you might want.
Right.
That's not going to happen. You will get a warm body, you will get an adrenaline rush, and you'll get a story to tell your friends, which is in some ways the most important part of the hookup.
It is, right? You're listening to Sex with Emily. I'm Dr. Emily, and I'm here to help you prioritize your pleasure and liberate the conversation around sex. So where do men get their earliest messages around sex and intimacy? Why do they talk about banging, pounding, hitting it like they're at a construction site? And how does this conditioning affect your sex life, no matter your gender? Peggy Ornstein is the author of several iconic books on teens and sex. But on today's fan favorite episode, she joins me to talk about boys and sex, a fascinating account of young men as they navigate hookups, porn, and relationships, as told by the boys she interviewed. In this episode, you'll learn how even in the shadow of Me Too, boys are still confused about having mutually fulfilling sex while still being a man. Listen, when it comes to masculinity, Peggy is an expert. She explains why she doesn't love the term toxic masculinity. She recognizes that men get a confusing message. Be dominant, but don't be too aggressive. Reporting from the front lines of bro culture, Peggy reveals the sex conundrum that men so often find themselves in and ways we can all evolve to have relationships that are more interesting, more erotic, and more emotionally intelligent. Intentions with Emily for each episode. Join me in setting an intention for the show. I do it. I encourage you to do the same. My intention is to help all of you, no matter your gender, learn about boys and the messages they're given about sex so we can all have less misunderstandings, more compassion in communication, and legitimately hotter connection. Please rate and review Sex with Emily wherever you listen to the show. My new article, The Top Sex Myths You Need to Stop Believing, and my holiday gift guide is up at sexwithemily.com, and check out my YouTube channel for more sex tips and advice. If you want to ask me questions, call my hotline, 559-TALK-SEX or 559-825-5739. Just leave me your questions or message me at sexwithemily.com/askemily. All right, everyone, enjoy this episode. Peggy Ornstein is the author of New York Times bestsellers Boys and Sex, Girls and Sex, Cinderella Ate My Daughter, and Waiting for Daisy. A contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and Afar, Peggy has also written for such publications as the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and the New Yorker. And her TED Talk, What Young Women Believe About Their Own Sexual Pleasure, has been viewed over 5.6 million times. Find more of Peggy Ornstein at peggyornstein.com or on Twitter at Peggy Ornstein or Instagram at PJ Ornstein. What was the biggest obstacle for you to talking to boys about sex rather than girls?
I mean, honestly, I think it was my own bias. I wrote about girls for 25 years. I wrote about girls and women for 25 years. And boys, people would say, well, you should do a book about boys now after Girls and Sex came out. And I just sort of I think that's somebody else's job. But I also realized that I'd been in kind of the trenches of young people and sex and social life at that point for 5 years. And I knew the terrain really well. And so I thought, well, I don't know, maybe I could do it. And I started sort of talking to boys and then the Me Too movement came along and suddenly the scope of sexual misconduct became apparent and there was a mandate to reduce sexual violence. But it also felt like a moment that was an opportunity to engage boys, maybe for the first time, in these conversations about sex and intimacy and masculinity and gender dynamics. But my big fear and my big bias was that they wouldn't say anything, that, I would have whole transcripts that consisted of,
right.
Nope.
Right. Exactly. Right.
Right. That they don't have a reputation for chattiness.
No, exactly.
So the biggest surprise, I think, of even more than any specific conclusion in the book was just how much they wanted to talk, how eager they were to talk, and how really honest and blunt they were.
Because nobody ever asked them. They don't have models of it in their culture with their parents. They're involved in this, the bro culture, which you talk a lot about.
Yeah.
And when Me Too happened, I was and everyone's oh, men, toxic masculinity. And I just thought, I feel so bad for these young boys.
Right.
And all boys, really, because they're we never learned any of this. So I love to hear that when you sat down, they actually did want to open up.
the truth is that nobody does ask boys, and nobody's listening to them, and that they are wrestling with these issues now. I think it was a very opportune moment to do a book like this, because I don't know. I mean, one of the things that was really interesting with the boys was how they were wrestling with ideas that I think maybe 5 or 10 years ago they wouldn't have even been considering.
Well, that's the thing, timing, right?
And so being able to catch them as a new generation was considering these ideas. And the whole toxic masculinity thing, somebody wrote to me the other day and said, why do you always put it in quotes? And I said, well, because I don't really like to use that phrase. I don't think when you're talking to boys that it serves us very well in trying to help bring them in and help them understand and help them to examine themselves and go forward in the best way they can. So I've started sociologists use this term, precarious masculinity. And I think that's a lot better because I think it's still evocative of what gets triggered for guys in certain situations that makes them act in ways that are not advantaging them or their partners. It's kind of less hostile.
Yeah, but that's the thing. It's also hostile. So it's like, they're like, well, that's really scary. I don't, when they're starting to hear about it, I don't want to be that guy, but now what do I do? And you're right.
And it also disconnects. I mean, you don't think you're after that guy. So the thing that always interested me was sort of the contradictions people live with. So with girls, it was sort of about all these new expectations that we had of girls about standing out, about shining bright, while also still hanging on to these old assumptions that we hadn't really dispensed with of being pleasing, defining yourself through your body, all these other ideas, defining yourself from the outside in. And with guys, they're now living with contradictions and these new ideas and old ideas layered on top of each other. And that was kind of what interested me to examine. So, they saw themselves as progressive. A lot of them, they thought, girls were deserving of their place in the classroom. They weren't saying like, girls can't do math, girls can't be president. That was all gone. They thought girls could be leaders, all that. But yet when I would ask them like, what's the ideal guy? They would still start channeling 1955.
Right.
And it would still be about dominance, aggression, athleticism, wealth, sexual conquest, and, the body count being the kind of measure of the man, and using partners as disposable, regardless of how you feel about that, regardless of how they feel about that, and emotional suppression. All those things that they call it, the man box or whatever you want to call it, that simultaneously disconnect. I mean, boys would talk to me all the time about training themselves not to feel, or putting a wall up. And the only thing they were allowed were happiness and anger, that kind of thing. And we know that there can be real rewards of embodying or embracing those rigid norms, right? It turns out you can be president by embracing those norms,
well, exactly.
Right? Right?
Yes.
So there are models that show boys that you can be very successful with that, but it comes at a huge cost. And we know that guys who cling more to those norms are, yes, they're more likely to harass, assault, bully, but they're also more likely to be the victims of violence. They're more likely to be in car accidents, to binge drink, to be depressed, to die by suicide, to have fewer friends, to be lonely. I mean, it's not a pretty picture.
No.
A lot of conversations started with, I've never talked to anybody about this before, or saying at the end that, it was cathartic, or it was therapy, or
it feels like it.
Some boys who would say, so when are we going to have another interview? And, some of them I would interview repeated.
I love it, but it also hurts my heart. Like, where do they go now? I'm going to go back to them shutting down emotionally, because I think that's so interesting. It's about, you say like it's about age 5 or 6, something happens. It could be even younger, like even pre-memory, but they're like, you have to repress these emotions. You can't, it's not okay to feel. Can you explain the repetition of them saying like, what the experience was for them at those ages? They kind of explained to you the shutting down. They kind of remembered it.
Yeah. They would talk about building a wall. They would talk about being trained not to feel. They talk about a lot of messages from their fathers. And what was interesting about that was that, there were some guys who said, my dad told me to man up, not be a little bitch, that kind of thing. But that wasn't most of them. For most of them, they would say, my dad wasn't sexist. My dad wasn't homophobic. I didn't learn that, they used the phrase toxic. They all knew that phrase, toxic masculinity from him. But I did learn the stunted side of masculinity, because he was not a guy who'd talk about emotions. He was more of a sigh and walk away kind of a guy than the kind of guy who'd asked you what was going on. And so I learned not to have those conversations from him. So there was the subtler ways that they would learn that too, and not just from their dads. There's research, when you say pre-memory, there's research that shows that mothers speak with less emotional range and use less emotional language with their infant boys
Yeah.
than with their infant girls. And they over-attribute their boys' responses as in infants to anger. And there's a classic study that shows adults watch a video of an infant being startled by a jack-in-the-box. And if they're told in advance that the baby is a boy, whether or not that's true, baby's wearing a diaper, we don't know what the baby is, they are more likely to attribute the baby's response to the jack-in-the-box as anger as opposed to fear or surprise or anything else. And so there's a way that from the beginning, boys, first of all, live in a more impoverished emotional environment and also learn that all of those, that whole bucket of emotions that involves sadness, grief, pain, betrayal, frustration, all gets poured into the funnel of anger. And we can see in the culture the impact of that across the board.
Yeah. What can parents do now? How can they talk to their kids about masculinity?
Well, I think there's a number of things. There's always something in the news we can talk about. There's always something that we can bring up. If you have little boys still, to be able to name their emotions is super important. So to say, it seems like you're sad, or wow, that must be frustrating. Or when they are going straight to anger, taking a step back and trying to figure out what's underneath that anger so you can name that for them. And particularly if men in their lives can do that, whether it's their dad or, whoever the man in their life is, to be able to speak with compassion and connection to boys and listen to them and model that as a guy, hugely important.
Yeah.
And for older boys, like I was thinking about the other day, like Kobe Bryant's death, super tragic, a horrible thing. I mean, there was a bunch of things that you could talk about relating to that. One of them is the outpouring of grief by adult men and what that looked like and how profound it was. And why is it that the only time that men get to express that is when something this tragic in public happens, and then
sports,
it's okay.
So it's safe.
And it's
because you talk a lot about sports in your book and athleticism and how,
And so that was
safe.
There was a lot that made it safe for them to express emotion around that. So if you're just talking to your teenage boy about that, they can have a conversation around like, why is that safe? Why is that okay? What other situations would you be able to cry? Why not? What does that mean about guys? I mean, there's a whole series of conversations you can have around something like that in the news.
Right. No, that's true. That's such a great example of it because it's so true that sports made it safe. I hadn't even thought about that, but it's very true. And I mean,
there's the more complicated conversations you can have too around the Kobe Bryant death, around assault and around race and around a number of things.
There's it's chock full.
There are so many conversations that yields that are really valuable, and you just have this moment where you can step in and have them.
So it's like sports is kind of like an outlet to let out their emotion, and it's also like the bro culture and the locker room talk.
It can be a smokescreen. I mean, those all-male environments can be a crucible of change, and I talk about some ways in the book where they have been, particularly if it's coach-led, where those environments can shift in really profound ways. But too often, that sports culture, while it can be fun and it preaches that it builds character and camaraderie and brotherhood and all this stuff, it's also a smokescreen for the worst kind of bro culture and an us against them mentality, homophobia, misogyny, bonding, asserting your heterosexuality and bonding as men through the control of female bodies. So what do they say when they're talking about sex in the locker room, right? They hit that, they tap that, they bang, they pound, they hammer, they pipe that. It's like they went to a construction site, right? It's not like, it's not an act of intimacy. And so the guys that I was talking to, it's not like they were all like, and that's cool, like
they didn't think it was like,
no. Right. And I think a lot of guys don't, they wanted to speak up. They didn't know how to speak up. One guy talks about trying to speak up and being shot down, and then his friend continues to try, and when it happens again, and he doesn't, and he said, I just watched my friend and nobody, the guys weren't listening to him anymore. He lost all his social capital, and here I had buckets of it and I wasn't spending it, and I don't know what to do because I don't want to have to choose between my dignity and these guys, but how do I make it so I don't have to choose? And Michael Thompson, who's a psychologist who writes about boys, has said that it's silence in the face of cruelty and misogyny in which boys become men. And I thought about that a lot in those situations and what boys, not only what they did say and did do, but what they couldn't do and couldn't say, and all of that and how that was shaping who they were.
Did you see in talking to them, would they ask you and say, well, what could I do now? How could I change this? Or was it more like, this is just how it is?
So when I was interviewing them, I would say not so much because it wasn't my role. But as I've gone around with the book, like I just the other day had a Division I athlete come up to me at a reading and say, so what do I do? Like, I want to stop this. And what do I do? And I sort of said, well, in a signing line at a reading, hard for me to give you the full answer. But he emailed me later and I just, I gave him a bunch of resources, a bunch of ideas about like, it depends. It depends on, is your coach somebody who you can approach and talk to about this, who might be open to bringing some programming in that would change the culture of the locker room? That would be thing one. Maybe he is, maybe he's not. If he's not, then like, how could you reach out to other people who you feel would be on your team that are on your team? And how could you, what kind of things could you do that would sort of social norm some of this stuff, to change it? If there's one guy who's really a major perpetrator and you're friendly with him, are there ways to take him aside when it's not a threatening time and just like speak your piece? And he's going to push back and say, what, dude, do I need to get you a tampon? Or,
Exactly.
Whatever. Oh. And you can say, you can say that, but I'm still going to tell you, this is how I feel. I just wanted to let you know I'm not okay with this. And okay, now let's go back and play our video game or whatever.
Right, exactly.
Like how you just like some different options from a more collective option to a more individual option.
Because we're just not teaching these kids even basic communication skills.
Communication skills.
Why are we teaching that in schools?
Yeah.
We're wasting
so like if you start there, you're starting with these basic communication skills that nobody has talked to kids about. Like when you're wondering like how they can't have conversations around consent or why they don't know what positive sexuality is, geez, they can't even get here.
Right. Like after spending so much time with girls, 25 years with girls, and now you're like, oh God, now here I am with men. That must have been, and boys, that must have been such an interesting contradiction. But were there contradictions though when you sat down, a contrast? And then when you sat down, was there anything that you kept hearing from boys that was just like, I don't know. That must have been, was there ever a moment where you're like, wow, this makes so much sense to how my girls work to actually hear it?
I think the one place of real overlap in both books is the chapter on hookup culture.
Yeah. Let's talk about that.
And they're the same and they're different. And so much of the girl book, and I always say my job is not to tell young people the context in which they're supposed to have sex. That's not my role. But to demystify the hookup culture, and to give them a sense of what you are likely and not likely to get from those sorts of encounters, I think is really helpful for them in understanding their choices and the results, and also understanding how it vastly overstates what other people are doing, and gives you false ideas about what's happening.
So give me an example of that. Some of the hookup culture stuff that seemed like it was that was sort of the same.
Different. So this, obviously what's the same is that they're both immersed in this culture, and that this hookup culture is telling them that, drunk detached sex is the ideal.
Still, it makes me so upset. I know. Blackout.
Yeah, right.
It'd be great. You won't remember. You did it. Yeah.
You haven't gone out unless you blacked out.
Yeah.
That was still something that they would say.
I still think about that from your girls' book, how you kept saying like, because then I started seeing it everywhere about how these girls, they're all just blacked out. And again, having nieces at that age, it was just like listening to them saying like, I was wasted. I'm like,
and how good can the sex be in that situation? And what was the same too was that while girls had a lot more anger and betrayal around hookup culture tends to teach kids what they don't want. That tends to be the big lesson of hookup culture. Mm-hmm. But the girls would express a lot of anger and a lot of betrayal. And some of them were telling me that they were into it too. But, when it was going wrong from them, the boys didn't express that so much, but it was really clear that it wasn't serving them either.
Okay.
And they would say things like, one of the guys said, it's like two people having two distinct experiences, and there's not a lot of eye contact. There's not a lot of communication. And it's like you're acting vulnerable without being vulnerable, which with somebody that you don't know very well and don't care about very much. So he said, I don't know that it's always a problem necessarily, which one could argue about, but he said it's not, he said it's odd and it's not really fun.
Because they don't have anything to compare it to either. Like this is their first experience of sex.
So it seems like, the valuation is wrong. So they're thinking what you want is experience. and that's what gets you experience. What you want is, as opposed to like wanting to understand your body, wanting to greater humanity in your partner, wanting to have something reciprocal and enjoyable and, that collaborative, none of that
It's almost like a sports mentality. Like the more runs I do, like if it's skiing, like the more hills I go down, the more people I bang, the more people, then it's really going to help me. Then I'll be a better lover or better.
And you're
sex,
not, one of the things that I always say is one thing you will not learn in a hookup is the skills you need to, create good sex or the emotional connection you might want.
Right.
That's not going to happen. You will get a warm body, you will get an adrenaline rush, and you'll get a story to tell your friends, which is in some ways the most important part of the hookup.
It is, right?
Right. And so one of the things that I talked about a lot in the girl book was like the irrelevance of female orgasm in a hookup.
Irrelevance. It doesn't even come up. It doesn't even,
it's not a thing. No. Like it's nice if it were to happen. That would be certainly not a bad thing.
Right.
But nobody's expecting it.
No.
It's not that's not what you're there for. That's not what it does.
No.
And so I was interested in talking to guys about that. And it turned out that, they would say in a relationship, the orgasm gap shrinks a lot, but in a hookup, it's huge. And guys would say, I know it sounds bad, but I don't really care in a hookup. And
do they even know about orgasm though? Do they know about the clitoris? Do you feel like they were educated?
No, no, they know women have orgasms, not really. And they know like conceptually an idea that there's a thing called a clitoris, but how the whole situation
goes down,
works and happens
Nothing
and
at all.
Might happen that not so clear. And there's a lot of misunderstanding. And one of the misunderstandings, and this was not really about orgasm, it was about satisfaction, was that, and this was where it felt really interesting to have the books kind of in conversation with one another. The guys did care about female satisfaction. They just didn't define it through orgasm. So how they defined it in a hookup was because, again, it's about the invisible audience in the room, right? It's about what you're going to go back and tell your guys, what she's going to go back and tell her girls. So how they were measuring female satisfaction was based on penis size and stamina, mostly stamina in intercourse.
Like
how long you last.
We went for 2 hours
exactly.
And she thought my penis was massive.
Well,
Success.
No, but it's also what she's going to tell her friends, not what you're going to tell your friends.
Right.
So one guy would say to me like that, had gotten the habit in a hookup of looking at the clock before he started intercourse so that he would last what he can believe to be a sufficient amount of time, because he said it wasn't really even about her pleasure. It was about my ego and making sure that when she went back to her friends, she wouldn't say she was disappointed and that she would, say that I was okay.
It's almost like a Yelp review for sex.
So the girls then are colluding in that because they're going back and saying, it was great. He had a big dick, or it was great. He lasted for 10 minutes. But then they're not saying, and by the way, I didn't have an orgasm and that's not what gets me off,
Right. Exactly.
Or they were faking.
Yeah, they fake all the time.
And that's the other thing, was that guys vastly overestimate girls' orgasms and hookups. So they do think the girls are having orgasms, and that's sometimes because they don't know what that is, and it's sometimes because the girls are faking.
Yeah.
So there's like a whole dynamic that's at play that undermines any communication and undermines, mutual satisfaction and undermines connection. So the other part in terms of connection is that after a hookup, you're supposed to be less friendly than before. So although what hookup culture means and why, obviously casual sex has always existed.
Casual sex, hookup, yeah.
But hookup culture is the idea that casual sex is the normalized path to a relationship, even though most hookups don't lead to a relationship. And that's partly because you're supposed to be less friendly afterwards. So guys would talk about like averting their eyes if they saw a girl that they'd hooked up with. And I would go like, well, why would you do that? And he said, well, the guy that I was talking to said, well, you don't know what they're thinking. And maybe they're thinking it was just something that happened at a party. And then you're the idiot if you say, hi, like if you're like, think it was like they think that then you think it was something more, and you don't want to be in that position. So you just avert your eyes to avoid the whole thing.
Right.
And I said, so you'd rather avert your eyes than take the tiny risk of saying hello to the person that you made out with last night or had sex with last night or whatever you did last night. And where there might be the possibility then that you could have the relationship that you say you want. And you just went, yeah, that's right.
That's right.
That's right. And it's this whole
it's vulnerable, right? But they don't want to be vulnerable.
And that's what he said. He said, you don't want, and that's why I said again, like I did a search at one point of how many times people said vulnerable in this book. And it was so many, like
at least they knew the word.
Well, it's really what I think is at the heart. like even beyond sex.
Absolutely. It's vulnerability. We're all afraid of being hurt, not being loved, right?
And the taboo against it for guys, and embracing it and rejecting it and denying it and avoiding it is threaded all the way, all the time through the book. And Brene Brown says that emotional vulnerability is the secret sauce that holds relationships together. So if they can't be vulnerable, or they feel a taboo against it, or they feel denied it as guys, then we are denying them the very thing they need to have the mutually gratifying, personally fulfilling relationships that we want young people to have.
Right. So essentially we're saying they're never going to get there unless they learn to experience this range of emotions and learning to be vulnerable in all
and
areas
be brave
of their life.
And have the true courage.
Yeah.
The true courage, which is the courage to like see the other person and try to connect with them, you know? So
and we're not setting them up for that in colleges. Was there any surprises though? Was there anyone who was like, they were in a healthy relationship?
Oh, yeah.
There were some cases
for
of
sure.
that, but,
or guys who were coming out
the
the other side of that culture, a little bit older, and were thinking about things in a different way. There's one guy that I talk about. It's actually there's this great scene in that hookup chapter that this guy who he calls himself a feminist fuckboy, which I loved. Some people call that guy a soft boy or something, something like that. But he was somebody who, he talked a good game of being an egalitarian guy. He was very conscious of consent. But he also treated his partners as disposable. And he also used the skewed ratio of girls to guys on campus that advantaged guys and allowed them to call the shots in what was going to happen. He used that, and he knew he was using that to get, sleep with as many girls as he could. And when I met him, he was getting to a point where he was saying that he was starting to think about that and think that maybe that was not serving him so well. And so he was thinking about that. And then I talked to him about a year later, and we were talking about where he was at. And while we were talking, this other boy who was a senior in high school and was looking at colleges, where he'd been accepted, deciding where he was going to go, texted me from one of the campuses. And he said, something like, WTF with hookup culture. It's like an orgy down here. Do I just go to Bone Town and, forget about emotion? I mean, in case you were wondering how they spoke to me.
No, I get it. No, perfect. That's how they,
Right. And he was like, and worry about emotional connection later, or do I just forget about that in part entirely? And so I read that text to the feminist fuckboy guy, his name was Wyatt, and said, what do you have to say to Nate? What should I tell him? And they ended up having this conversation through me.
Oh, wow.
And talking about being your authentic self, and how if you try to be somebody you're not, it's going to kill you. And there's lots of people who have a different idea on campus about what they want. They don't participate in that. You don't have to. And Nate then, texted me back and said, that's just what I needed to hear. Oh. Thank you. And little heart emoji. And
I love it.
And I know, because he's somebody that I stay in touch with, that conversation supported him in being the guy he wanted to be as he went away to college, when he finally chose where he was going to go, and that he is the guy he wants to be. He's been able to maintain his integrity in that way, and his personal ideals. And I thought, those guys are strangers to one another. They never met. They don't know each other's real names. And they barely know me. Right. I'm really a stranger. But what if they could talk like that to boys and men in their real lives? What if they could have those kind of connected, deep conversations?
I know. I was just trying to think of could there be some kind of chat, Facebook group? I mean, maybe this exists. And there are more
there's more of that.
Masculinity, all these things coming out.
Or even in another scene in that chapter, I sit down with a group of guys and girls together, and it's after the day after the party, the day after the night before. And we have a conversation about all of this. And they were so into it, and they were so amazed by what the other sex said. And then at the end, we talked for an hour and a half, 2 hours. And I got up to leave, and they said, can we do this again next week? And I was like, yes, but not with me, because I'm an adult and don't live in the dorm.
Exactly. But it's like a little group thing. But just got a taste of it.
Just the idea. They were like, wow, we had no idea. And but that was like a co-ed group too. And that was really interesting.
That is amazing.
It was the only time I'd sat down with a co-ed group, and they were like, we want to do this again.
And they were how old? They were in college.
They were 18, 19. They were freshmen in college. Yeah.
That's what they need. It has to be required in campuses right now. There's a lot of work to do here.
Yeah.
Because it's really, the hookup culture thing has been going on now since, when did they first coin that? Early
the
2000s?
90s.
Or was it late 90s?
Yeah.
it just seems like, I remember one year there was like 5 books that came out on the hookup culture. And it was just like, is that still happening? And we just see, it's just so not satisfying.
Yeah, it's entrenched. It's absolutely, and I think my favorite book on it is American Hookup by Lisa Wade. I just think it's so smart.
It is, yeah. I mean, that is one of them. It's true, and I think setting it up before they get into college. Yeah, how do we do that? Like in orientation, I know.
But it needs to go well before college because now what has happened, what I think has changed is that culture has drifted downward. So that it's now really prevalent on high school campuses as well. And they don't, when they talk about a hookup in high school, they're usually not talking about intercourse,
right? But
they're still talking about a kind of detached experience, whatever is in that experience, a disconnected, detached experience that is often typically happens while wasted. Yes, I think that, we need to be having those. I mean,
what age though? Don't you think though it has to start like consent
birth?
I agree.
We need to be talking about kids
your
from
scrotum, here's your clitoris, here, anatomy.
Here's your vulva. Yeah.
That's what I think it starts with anatomy and then consent. Don't let anyone touch you. It's private.
And you need to ask before you hug somebody and not letting
Do you think all of that? Is that what they do?
And like
Berkeley,
if your kid, if great Aunt Nancy comes over and wants to put a big smooch on your kid and your 4-year-old goes, I don't want to kiss great Aunt Nancy. Well, great Aunt Nancy's just got to suck it up. You don't get to kiss because that is a consent issue. That is bodily integrity. Those are really important lessons. It's not just what you don't do. It's what what people don't do, even people in your life, even people you love, even your friends,
exactly.
Just saying, can I give you a hug? It's not that big of a deal.
It's not that big of a deal. And in fact, it's like,
and it really
feels so much
scaffolds.
better.
It scaffolds into those more, if you're coming in at 16, you can do it for sure.
Right.
And you can say like, there's a lot of conversations we didn't have and I regret that. And now we're going to have them. It's harder. It's a lot easier if you've been talking about these issues openly since your child was able to speak.
Exactly. We're going to hear a quick word from our sponsors. After the break, Peggy tells me how the influx of porn has drastically changed boys' initial introduction into sex and sexuality. Also, like with porn now too, with all the boys. I mean, that's the thing. I get texts too from like friends' sons, friends' daughters. Like, what do I do? And it's just like, it is the whole, they don't want to talk to their parents about it. But if you start young, then it's just the most normal thing in the world.
And it's easier. And also having, lucky your friends' kids that they have you. But you can have the cool aunt or the cool uncle or the older cousin or even the older sibling that steps in and takes, and does some of that. That's fine. But yeah, the porn conversation. I mean, that's one of the reasons.
Talk about porn. Because that's why we got to start early because they're seeing it at 9, 10, 11.
Well, I just was talking to somebody whose daughter at 12 got busted for she and some other girls were sending really degrading and violent hardcore images to one another on text and to people who did not ask to have those sent to them. So there were legal issues, there were consent issues, but more than that, I was talking about it with my daughter, who's 16, and I said, and this was an opportunity for me to have a conversation with her. I was just saying, it's such a bummer. Like you're 12 years old, and that's what you're seeing about
they were saying
sex.
like naked photos too,
not just naked, but like really graphic and violent.
Right. Okay.
And that's the thing that we have to realize. It's not like they're sending Playboy centerfolds to each other. Right. If you don't know what today's porn looks like, you need to look at it because what has changed. I mean, obviously,
like bondage, just like that kind of,
or like a woman with being gagged by a penis with mascara running down with her tears.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Okay. I mean, you're seeing that when you're a 12-year-old girl. That sucks.
I know.
That's so disturbing.
That sucks.
Yeah, it sucks.
You're
it's just like. Now you can't unsee that.
You can't.
Now that's in your, your head. I mean, it's just sad. Yeah. And it always reminds me of one of the guys who said to me, I mean, the whole porn conversation, and we'll have that in a second, but one guy just kind of, and this was a guy who was pretty like into hookup scene and into all this stuff. And he just went, but I feel like the thing with porn is that it's made it for our generation, like just the natural process of discovering sex without preconceived notions of what it is. He said that's just been fucked for us by porn.
There's no
and that
surprise.
was like the saddest thing to me of all, like that you just don't get to find it out without these prepackaged ideas being fed into your head. That's just sad.
That is really sad because you can't unsee any of it. So of course you think that that's what sex is going to be,
or it affects you. It absolutely affects you. So all saying all that, I always want to say, and I know that you know this, that curiosity about sex is normal. Masturbation, yay! Everybody should be doing it, as much as possible. What's different is that, and we could debate for adults whether there's such a thing as ethical porn or feminist porn or queer porn or all these other kinds of things. Some people say yes, some people say no, whatever. That's all behind a paywall. That's not what kids are looking at. What we're talking about is that the paywall got dropped by Pornhub in 2007, basically. And so that allowed you to get access anything anonymously for free.
It was 2007
at any time on your smartphone. And that's what changed. And so that version of porn shows kids over and over sex is something that men do to women, that female pleasure is a performance and really like wildly distorted.
Not accurate.
She's
not going to show up with 3 friends.
Nope, she's not.
Squirt.
And start just screaming the second it just doesn't work that way.
Right.
It doesn't work that way, right? And that's what they see. And when we're not talking to them, when they're not getting anything in school, when there's nothing countering that narrative about what sex actually is, what's real, what's not real, what's missing, sensuality, playfulness, messiness, passion, all these things.
Passion, romance, intimacy.
When we're not talking about any of that with them, this is their sex educator.
Right.
This is
it's either you or you porn.
Right. It's you or you. Thank you very much. It's you or you porn. That's a very good line.
Thanks. You can use it.
Thank you.
I've used your lines all the time.
But
it's true.
And that's what they take into the bedroom. And the boys respond. It was one of the things they most wanted to talk about.
Do they know it's not real? You said they do.
Well, they do and they don't.
Because they don't know what, they're like, oh, I hear what you're saying, but I don't know what else it is.
They responded in a lot of different ways. Some guys had said, I'm kind of done with this because I don't like what it's doing to my fantasy life. I don't know what it's doing to my mind.
How old were the boys that said that they were done with it?
Well, one of them was a senior in high school.
Okay.
And he said what did it for him was that he was sitting in class one day and he looked over at the girl next to him and he started wondering what she would look like with cum on her face.
Oh my God.
And he said it wasn't even like he was thinking, what would it be like to kiss her? What would it be like to see her naked? Nothing. It was like, what would she look like with cum on her face? And he just went, oh shit. And like he said, that's it. I got to stop this.
Wow.
And so that was like a kind of deep thing.
Like I wish he would like go to his friends that day.
Right.
From work,
Well, and they would say like there were guys, one guy said to me that there was a guy on his crew team who was legendary because he had stopped using porn. And they said, well, what do you do? And he said, I use my imagination.
Right.
And the other guys were just like, how do you do that? Like it wasn't even a thing.
Right.
If you grew up after 2007 with Pornhub, it wasn't even really a thing. So, part of it was like, you're not going to get rid of the porn, but like, can we broaden their idea of what you might, how you might approach masturbation that might not only be more pleasure. I mean, and distinguishing between what's super arousing and what's actually pleasurable and wanted and desirable. That was one thing I talked a lot about.
Like,
what that means.
Yeah. Let's talk about that.
So I looked at, do you know Emily Nagoski's work?
Yes.
So she's fantastic, right? The book Come As You Are is like a Bible. And she talks about genital nonconcordance, which is that you can be aroused by something that the body will do what the body will do. So if the body thinks that something sexual is afoot, it will react, it will lubricate, it will get an erection, even if you're thinking, ick, right? Because and that's why a woman can orgasm during a rape. Or, you can get an erection from something that you find repugnant. And in fact, what Emily will say is that there's a way that when you find something both objectionable and sexual, that it actually will turbocharge arousal.
Because you're getting all the dopamine,
because there's like all this stuff going on in your brain and make it actually more arousing than something that's desirable. Sometimes guys would talk about seeing stuff that was like stuff that you would never even think of, like really off the charts. It would be arousing to them and they would be disturbed by the fact that it was arousing to them. And so I think understanding some basic aspects of physiology and genital nonconcordance and that whole thing is really important when you're going into a porn world. So you can kind of say, oh, there's a reason why I feel like I'm not into this, but my body's going, yeah. I can understand that better and maybe respond to it differently.
So what happens though now is though, we talk about the genital non-concordance, is that they're actually seeing it. And maybe it's something like, maybe the first time they do see a gangbang or choking
and they think ick, but then it becomes...
And then the next time and the next time, they skip right over it. It could happen in a matter of seconds or a few times. So what we're saying is to even identify that moment in time, hopefully before it happens.
Yeah. Is useful.
Because they also
it's not a shaming, blaming thing. It's just saying, like, look, hey, this is how this works.
So
how do you think about this? And then there was a whole another set of guys, of course, who said, and there was a small subset of guys who felt really deeply harmed. And I can't say whether it was a chicken and the egg thing, in terms of their porn use, but I can say that they never talked to an adult before about it, and that they were struggling and they wanted to talk to somebody about it. And then there was
which part of it? The part that they
about
felt
that they felt harmed.
Self-loathing
they
after,
felt, or they felt that it had skewed their ideas of sex. They felt they were being aroused by things they didn't want to be aroused by. They felt that it had taught them negative lessons. They felt that it shaped that it. I mean, there's some research that shows that guys who are regular porn users are more likely to believe those images are true, more likely to want to act them out in the bedroom, and they're more likely to. They're less satisfied with their partnered experiences, with their own performance, with their partner's bodies, and so. It was some of that kind of thing, like a boy who said that he said, I don't know if it's totally porn driven, but I think it certainly made a difference that I watched all this porn, that I've developed a very, very specific idea of a female body that turns me on. And so when I'm with my girlfriend and she doesn't, she's saying she doesn't feel good about her body in some way. And I'm thinking, I'm saying to her, no, I love your body. But he said privately, I'm thinking, but I wish your nipples were a little darker and a little larger, because that's really what I get off on when I'm looking at the porn stuff. And he said, it just doesn't feel good to me.
Right. And he doesn't know how to undo it because that's all he's really,
and he doesn't know, like, who knows if that's driven by porn or not. I can't say.
It must be though, right? I mean, how else would he have had these images of different nipples?
That's what he says. And so, that kind of thing, he was just pondering that. Like, I don't know what kind of impact this had on me. I think I feel harmed by it. I can't say whether that's what harmed him, that is the reason for that or not. But I can say he wasn't talking to anybody about it. That there was no adult that he could ask any questions about that. And then the other bunch of boys were guys who would say, like, I know it's not real. I know the difference between fantasy and reality. And I would think, really? Because you've never actually, like, kissed a girl?
Right. How would you know? Never see anyone naked?
You've never seen anybody naked?
How would you do it? Right.
And we know the research that's not true, that the way media works, porn and we haven't, mainstream media, it's really easy to get down the rabbit hole of the porn conversation. Right. Mainstream media is a big issue too, obviously.
Yes.
How media works is that it affects our thoughts, feelings, and beliefs and behavior, even when we think it doesn't. And especially when we think it doesn't, which is why the Russians used media to undermine our democracy.
Exactly.
Because it works. That's why advertising is effective.
God, it's so true.
So even when you're saying, I know that's not real, I know that the media doesn't affect me, it affects other people, whether it's porn, whether it's mainstream media, whatever it is, that's not true.
No. Because that's an intellectual, but it's affecting your neural pathways, your brain, what's arousing to you. You can't.
And you see things like with mainstream media, I talk about a study out of University of Massachusetts where they showed college guys, they divided them into two groups, right? And they showed one group like whatever, cartoons or something. And the other group, they showed an edited together reel of sex scenes from R-rated movies, okay. not porn. And they said, and they were all scenes that had been judged to include things that were degrading to women. But they were not violent. So it was like male satisfaction, but not female satisfaction, or some kind of stripping thing that was where there was male domination and female submission. Those sorts of things. And when they had the guys read. All of them read one account of stranger rape and one account of acquaintance rape.
Okay.
And they reacted the same way to the stranger rape. That was wrong. But the acquaintance rape, the guys who just watched the reel of the R-rated movie stuff were much more likely to say that the woman secretly wanted what happened and got what she deserved and enjoyed it. And that held steady regardless of their attitudes towards sex, regardless of their attitudes towards porn, regardless of their attitudes towards gender and feminism. It affected them immediately. And they call it a spillover effect of media. So there's a spillover effect of this stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, how do they even... So if there is this spillover, I mean, of course, if that's all they're seeing, okay, so going back to the porn, if that's all they're seeing, and then also you talk to women about porn. I mean, your book was like, it was the same thing, that porn was still around when you did your book.
Right. Yes, it was. But the girls tended to look at it as a manual for what guys wanted.
So they're making the noises and they're moving
and the
in
body
certain ways.
and like feeling a lot of body inadequacy. And the boys felt a lot of body inadequacy around it too, but the girls felt, I think, even more.
So what are the boys saying that they like? Because the example of saying like, I like your nipples this way, like there's a lot more of that I know in the book too about what boys are actually finding attractive now they might not have before. And it's scenarios like I know the choking thing comes a lot. I get a lot of callers
the
and
choking.
listeners who are
So
like,
that's obviously that is straight out of porn.
Straight out of porn, because no one was asking me that 15 years ago.
Yeah, and that is a really huge change in American sexual behavior. That has shot up. Anal sex has shot up.
Anal squirting.
That was not a thing.
No, none of these things were things. And now they're all things every day. They're things now.
So those
that don't feel good, and that women think they have to do it. Maybe it feels good, but like you don't have to do it.
Maybe it does. But it's looking at what I was always looking at was like the motivation and the experience and the nature of the experience. So like when you look at anal sex, there was a survey of kids 16 to 18 in England about anal sex, and what came out of it was that it was something that the guys were doing not as an act of intimacy with a partner, but as a competition with other guys. They thought that girls would have to be coerced into it, and that they could be coerced into it. The girls reported finding it painful, not surprisingly. Yeah. And both sexes, this was a kind of interesting part, blamed that on the girls, saying that they couldn't relax, they were naive, they were flawed. Well,
women were so easy. We always take the responsibility. We do blame ourselves, but especially with anal, I could see that. I mean, yeah.
But we're talking about high school students, so the rates among high school students are still quite low, but they're much higher than they were.
Right. I didn't even college know about students. No one even brought up anal.
I know.
Like, right.
And college students. I mean, the rates among college students are significantly higher than they used to be. And again, maybe that's fine. Maybe that's about experimentation. Maybe that's about pleasure. If that's true, that's fine. But we know that on the largest survey of American sexual behavior, when anal sex is included, that 70% of women report pain in their sexual encounters.
Because they're not doing it right.
They're not doing it right. They don't know. Because again, we don't educate around that. Whether we're talking about two people with penises having anal sex or anal play, or people with a penis and people with a vagina. We don't discuss, or a vulva, we don't discuss the correct way that would make that a pleasurable experience. That's super taboo in sex. And that's one of the, I don't know, have you watched the movie Sex Education?
Yes. Oh yeah.
I mean, not the movie, the Netflix show.
I'm on season 2, episode 3.
So in season 2, I don't know if you've gotten to the part yet, but they end up having a whole conversation about preparation for anal sex.
I heard it was done well. I haven't seen it yet though.
It's very good. It's very good. And it really shows a way to do that is perfectly appropriate.
Right. That's, yeah. I mean, did you say, I was asking.
Which is not
I've seen it like
encouraging.
You slow down,
it's
breathe,
not,
use lube. We talk about it on the show a lot.
And it's not about like encouraging a behavior or, saying, hey, go do this or anything, but it's about, understanding human sexual behavior in a positive way. So whatever you choose to do, you will be doing it, well and pleasurably and not hurting the other partner and thinking that that's okay.
That's just people well, that's the other thing about porn where I believe is that like they don't show the warm up. No. They don't show the lube. They don't show the breathing, the consent. And it goes right. Look how easily it goes in the anus.
It goes in easily. There's no mess. There's no fuss. It feels good immediately. There's no pain. And that's what.
That's what they're seeing.
They're seeing
from very young ages in the porn, which I do believe. And people are like, do you believe in porn addiction? I'm like, I don't even need to label it, but there is a porn problem.
Right.
There's a porn challenge right now that is happening, especially if young men and young women, that's all that they're seeing with sex. How could it not impact their brain and what they're going to expect and how they're going to have sex?
If we're not having those conversations, nobody's having those conversations. You've got the sex educator right there. And mainstream media too. I mean, mainstream media is not giving them healthy messages either. And we understand that with girls. We understand that with, pretty broadly, we understand now that there are a lot of harmful messages bombarding girls about women and about sex in the media. And we as, parents, teachers, activists, whatever, therapists, we do a lot to help girls have a more critical lens so that they can resist some of that. We didn't say anything to boys.
Nothing to boys.
Nothing.
They've learned nothing about this.
Nothing.
Right.
And then they're in the same stew, turned up hotter. And like one guy said to me, I think music has a really big influence on how guys treat girls. Like he was a high school boy. He's like, you're driving around in the car with your guys all the time and you're hearing fuck that bitch and quit her 4, 5, 10 times in the space of 2 hours.
Yeah.
Of course it affects your mindset.
Of course there we go. Media again. That's what you're hearing.
Yeah.
I must fuck this bitch and quit her. If that's what it say, that's what I'm hearing in my head. Like that's what you do.
It just,
you don't fuck that bitch and stare into her eyes
that
intimately
it's affecting
and
you.
cradle her face and kiss
Yeah.
her. Take her to a nice meal. It's not saying that.
No.
It's saying quit her. Kick her out of your car.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not
So-
helpful.
Yeah. So that, he was just like, that I see guys thinking that way,
Yeah.
that's the ideal. That's racking up the body count and who cares about the person and her interests, whether it's physical or emotional, are really not part of the bargain.
Not
and
even.
a lot of guys that obviously don't do that. A lot of guys work their way through that, but there's just so much harm and misunderstanding and
It's so much harm. And then they have to undo that
Along
harm
the
all
way,
these
yeah.
years. Like with,
Yeah.
whether it's drinking or sexual assault on campus.
Yeah.
I know people were really open to you about that as well in the book.
Yeah, the guys. There's a chapter called "I Know I'm a Good Guy, but ... and
That's
it's
such.
I actually wanted to
perfect.
call the book that for a while because I heard that so much.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. Let's talk about that. I know.
Yeah.
And also, I want to talk about hilarious.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
good too.
So-
yeah.
So with these,
I know I'm a good guy, but this one
and then-
time, or
yeah, but
my
this
one friend.
time, or yeah, and a lot of and so there was a lot of that was about we think only monsters commit sexual assault, and anyone who commits sexual assault or sexual misconduct is a monster, and that blinds it. And so by transitive property, then I'll try this. I'm an English major, math is hard on me, but I'm a good guy. Therefore, a good guy cannot commit misconduct. So whatever it was I just did could not possibly be misconduct.
Right. Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, and so
I'll just repress it and not think about it, and it goes away.
Right. And guys, what research shows is that guys will, if they understand the definition of consent. There's this research actually out of Michigan.
Okay, great.
Where they could articulate a very clear definition of correct definition of consent. But when then they were asked about their last hookup and their last relationship, sex in their last hookup and last relationship, and when their actions didn't meet the definition, they expanded the definition rather than questioning their actions, because a good guy can't possibly have engaged in misconduct, and which is probably partly why the rates of sexual assault have not changed on college campuses.
I was hoping they were, but
Yeah, no, they haven't. Not
why
yet.
would they if
Not
we
yet.
haven't said anything to men?
Right. And that said, I will say that the guys, what was hopeful and promising was that the guys that I was talking to were telling me about these experiences where they hadn't been good guys, or where they were concerned that they hadn't been good guys. Maybe they had, maybe they hadn't, they didn't know. Were wrestling with them. And that I think 5 or 10 years ago, they wouldn't have even questioned them.
Right.
A lot of the things
they would
they'd
have
had,
asked them. It would have come up. You're
wouldn't
right.
have even come up. And it was coming up, and they were thinking like, was that okay? Was that not okay? I think it might not have been okay. What do I do if it wasn't okay? So it wasn't like,
What were meaning? Like someone was drunk or passed out, or
or
just
somebody
sort
didn't
of-
say yes but didn't say no. She just lay there. Right. Like, I don't know what that meant. Maybe it was fine. Maybe she was, just interested in, wanted to see what would happen. Maybe she froze and it wasn't consensual and she's walking around feeling traumatized. Maybe, this particular guy they then had intercourse a couple more times that was clearly consensual, and then she dumped him flat. Maybe she was trying to make it okay after having a non-consensual experience. So she had 2 consensual experiences and then thought, okay, I'm done.
Right.
Maybe she just didn't like him. I don't know.
Right.
He doesn't know. So a year later, after this had happened, we were talking, and we were talking, this guy was a big hookup artist guy, and he sort of stopped and said, I didn't think I was going to talk about this with you, but, okay, I want to talk about it. And he was wrestling with what should I do about that? How should I call, he said, I probably should call her and find out, but I'm not going to do that.
Right.
And
right.
so so that was really interesting. And then also I really struggled with how to add something to the discussion about campus sexual assault. And so what I ended up doing was a chapter on a restorative justice process, which is something where there's an emphasis on healing, accountability, and justice, but not necessarily punishment. In a lot of cases, especially on campus, especially in friend groups, let's just say it's a girl who's been harmed. She doesn't necessarily want the guy expelled or jailed or even suspended. She might, and that's fair. But if she doesn't, she just wants him to understand how he caused harm and to take responsibility for it and to not do it again.
Right, exactly. That's what we all want.
Right. And so this was a sort of alternative process that allowed for that. And I tell the story of two people, a guy and a girl. It's a kind of spin on he said, she said, because I go back and forth between them as they narrate what happened and the aftermath.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And it's a really important chapter to me because it should, like, he just thinks he's had a bad hookup. And she's like, I was just assaulted. And she's right.
Right.
You know, but his socialization has just led him into a false assumption. And that's what I always say. It's not miscommunication. It's false assumption. At a certain point, through things happen, and he recognizes that he has done something that qualifies as assault. And he falls apart, man, because he can't imagine that he's not a monster then. And it's about, you know, how does he put himself back together, stand up, and actually be a man,
right?
You know, and take responsibility for this and move forward as a better person who will do better in the world himself and in talking to his friends and others and educating others. And he does that,
right?
And it's the most incredible thing
to watch. It's such an inspiring story because you're like, this could happen. We could have this.
Yeah, because there's nothing unusual about this guy. He doesn't start out in a like particularly progressive place or a particularly fun. I mean, he's like, you know, he said he grew up with like Van Wilder movies and porn and uncles who told him it's not a good night out unless you get somebody's phone number and, you know, grind non-consensually against a bunch of girls. And he was coercive with previous partners and just wanted to get to his frat, get drunk and bang whoever's there. Bang whoever's there.
Up, yeah.
Yeah, there was nothing like unusual about him.
Right.
And the fact that he could
that's amazing
make this transformation.
Right. That is just
means that other guys could too.
It's like required reading.
Right. And it's an after the fact thing, not ideal, but at least it's a thing. It created an opportunity for him to be the man that he actually did want to be. And that I think a lot of guys want to be.
That changes the whole life. No one wants to be that guy. It changes his life trajectory. No one says, I'm going to be this asshole. In their head, they're thinking,
I'm not an asshole.
No, I'm not an asshole. And I want a relationship. Or maybe they want kids. And that this is the way they're going.
When he talks about his coercive behavior, first of all, it's a girl that he likes a lot.
Right. Let's talk about that.
What he does is he holds her head down and forces her to have oral sex. And as he said, he thought he was just being a teacher and a nice guy because she wasn't very experienced. Right. And he really liked her. He wanted to like go out with her.
Right.
And she's like, never spoke, you know, she was like out of there and going on her own.
I'm showing you. This is what I want.
Yeah, this is how you do this. And she's just thinking, no. And he's not sitting there thinking, I am a bad guy forcing this girl to do this. Ha, 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 ha. That's not what's happening. But he has a lot of false assumptions and a lot of socialization as a guy going into that room.
This is the thing that he wasn't stopped early on. He had the uncles.
Right. Nobody intervened and said, this is, you know, this is what sex should be. This is what coercion is. This is what these things are. Of course, he said they had the consent thing when he started college, like you have like
class,
right, like 45 minutes,
45-minute class.
And he thought, I would be the guy if I saw some guy dropping a roofie into a girl's drink who would, you know, intervene and, you know, beat that guy up and take the drink away. Like I'm so that good guy, right?
But
so he would never think that he was the guy who was causing harm. And he was a lovely guy, and he became a real lovely guy through this process. And again, shouldn't have come at the expense of somebody else that had to happen. But you could see that he was very ordinary, and there's nothing monstrous about him. But he just had a whole basket of bad socialization that needed to be examined and hadn't been. And if it had been, he might have been that guy before he got to that room. And he said in retrospect, he knows that's not the first time that he did something like that. He just thought that was what you did.
Yeah. Right. I think my first boyfriend did that. Now I'm still remembering that my boyfriend, but I was like 16, and I remember him like, this is how you do it. Put your head down. And I was like, I don't really want to, but you know what I mean? Like that's how
that's our socialization,
in the kitchen,
right?
I remember, and I'm like, exactly.
Right? And that's another way that the books were so much in conversation. And I talk about gay guys as being sort of a model of consent, right? Of negotiating those terms. And you see that, in queer spaces and kink spaces that there's much more navigating and explicit discussion of what the parameters are of an experience. And Dan Savage, so he talks about the 4 magic words that gay guys use at the start of an encounter, which are, what are you into? Which is like exactly the kind of open-ended question that, as opposed to like when we put it in a heterosexual conversation, what we tend to talk about is a series of yes or no questions that a guy is asking a girl and that she's responding to. Yes, no, right? That's not it. So that's lovely and open-ended. And I worry that if a guy who was a teenager or a young adult said to a girl, what are you into? She would say, I don't know.
Well, this is the thing.
Right? And that's how those books are in conversation.
I know.
That's how they're talking to each other. And that's how the socialization of guys and girls works with heterosexuals.
Such a great example.
To undermine communication and connection for everybody.
And that goes back to full circle of women, your book too, like Girls and Sex is what girls don't know. Women don't know what they want. All ages women don't know what they want. And if they do know even a little bit, they're afraid to ask for what they want because they're going to be rejected. It's going to be weird. They're not going to get it. They're going to see it as a slut.
Or it's going to be a burden. Or the guy's going to feel obligated. It's going to take up too much time. And then you feel guilt and then you can't do it. You can't feel it anyway. And
That's right. Exactly. That's why I think the first lesson, and this is why I talk about day in, day out, is that the first lesson for women and for men, but especially women right now, is what do you want? What do you like?
Right.
What feels good to you? And that starts with masturbation, communicative sex, figuring out what didn't I like about that experience.
Right.
Flip side of that, well, what might I like? What might work for me next time? So you can have an answer to that question. Because I remember for years before I even started this show, I would be with guys and they'd be like, does that feel good? Do you like it? And I would just say, yeah. Everything you're doing is great. Because I was like, am I going to say no? I have nowhere to go from here. I don't know what else to do in this situation to make this better or worse. I just want it to be over. In some cases.
Right.
Many cases. Now that I look back, right? So, but even still, I feel this with so many women, they don't know what they want.
Yeah. And I would say, the stats are 40% of teenage girls 14 to 17 have masturbated even once.
Yeah, I know. We got
it. So 60% never have. And when I would talk to girls, when I was doing Girls and Sex, they would say, well, I have a boyfriend to do that. And, that's the same guy who's like rummaging around like he's looking for a set of keys in there. He doesn't know what he's doing. They've never had an orgasm. And but the boys, they would never say, I'm not going to masturbate because I have a girlfriend to do that. No, they would not.
And women, I still hear my married friend, not my friends, or women I meet out. Well, no, I don't need a vibrator. I don't masturbate. I have a partner. That's why your books are so groundbreaking and important reads, I think, for everyone, men, women, parents, adults, children, everybody, to realize that like this is still where we're at. And there's so many more places to go right now with this conversation, but it's so important that we just educate ourselves on what we want, like what actually feels good to us, which seems like, I always tell people it's fun homework. It's like a good thing. Like sex is about pleasure. Can we put the fun back into sex? But no one's going to be able to teach you that. I mean, one of the things I used to think was someday my prince will come and so will I. That was my big, I really believe that. He's going to ride up on this white horse and he's going to show me everything about my body because I was certain I knew nothing. And that never happened. I wasn't one of those women that just, I had an orgasm. No, I didn't come at all until I took it into my own hands.
Well, or you are lucky if you happen as a woman to meet a partner that is collaborative and open in that way.
Yeah.
You're lucky. And then you discover a lot, but it's kind of happenstance.
Yeah.
It's luck.
Exactly. And then also with these ages, why it's so interesting that to choose from 16 to 22, they're not there yet. Many of them are not going to be there yet. So hopefully we see now people reading this book and hearing your messages that they realize it's an incentive to even start younger talking to kids, but meeting them also where they're at.
Yeah.
Because we want those adults out there. We want them to move into the world as, caring, loving partners, supporters.
Egalitarian, reciprocal, all that kind of stuff. And I used to say with girls all the time that I just didn't want their early experiences to be something they had to get over.
Yeah.
And I still very strongly believe that. And I don't know that guys' early experiences sometimes they are. Sometimes they're things they have to get over for sure.
Yes, we hear that.
But I also don't, I want their early experiences not only to be ones in which they don't cause harm, but that are actually pleasurable, reciprocal, sustaining. They deserve that too.
Right. We all deserve it. Well, thank you so much, Peggy Ornstein, for your work, for your book. This is such an important work that you're doing, talking to them. And because I think the way you write it and the way you really are getting into their minds and the brains and their lives of kids, all diverse sector of boys in this book and girls in the other book, is such an eye-opener. And I had never really read anything else like this work before. So when I first read girls and then boys, and I think it's a great service. And I hope it just opens up people's minds. Start talking today.
I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. That's it for today's episode. See you on Tuesday. Thanks for listening to Sex with Emily. Be sure to like, subscribe, and give us a review wherever you listen to the podcast, and share this with a friend or partner. You can find me on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Sex with Emily. Oh, I've been told I give really good email. So sign up at sexwithemily.com. And while you're there, check out my free guides and articles for more ways to prioritize your pleasure. If you'd like to ask me about your sex life, dating, or relationships, call my hotline, 559-TALK-SEX. That's 559-825-5739. Or go to sexwithemily.com/askemily. Special thanks to Acast for powering the Sex with Emily podcast. Was it good for you? Email me, feedback@sexwithemily.com.